What do you think? We have a CPA and tax expert with us. It just so happens, Larry, and his name is Daniel Geltrude. Daniel, what's your take on what Larry just offered?
Well, I'm very impressed with what Larry had to say. Are you sure you're not a CPA? Very impressive.
Larry's a pretty smart guy. I like Larry.
Thank you.
Larry's right on the money. And let me tell you this. I actually agree with the premise here that this is much ado about nothing. Let's look at what the New York Times is saying and where they're trying to lead people down a road. First of all, they have 3 pages of a tax return, which they shouldn't have, but they have it. And they take us down the road immediately to start saying Trump didn't pay taxes for 18 or 20 years. Immediately, having no basis for making that assumption. These net operating losses, they are meant to help businesses who sustain losses to not go out of business. So let's make the example really basic, because everybody wants to focus in on Trump and attack Trump because he's wealthy and he's successful. Let's take the plumber who has a $90,000 loss, okay? And the economy is tough, and he's fighting and scratching to get back. Well, when that business starts to come back, doesn't it actually seem right that he shouldn't have to pay taxes until he digs out of the $90,000 hole? That's what we're talking about. That's the intent. Now, the tax law is really complicated and changes need to be made. But on this specific issue, the reason everybody is getting so bent out of shape is, one, because the number's big. Well, Donald Trump is a big businessman, so the numbers are.
Well, what about Hillary Clinton saying in part 2 of her income tax, now she released it herself, it wasn't obtained illegally, that she took a $699,000, $540 tax deduction herself, and this was in 2015. What do we interpret from that? That was based on long-term capital gains and losses.
Well, it's the same thing here, Sean. What the New York Times is trying to say, infer rather, is that the tax laws were written for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. That's what they're inferring. They're using words like tax avoidance. There's no basis for tax avoidance here.
By the way, let's also not forget this was not just for Donald Trump. That's nonsense. I was there in Washington, Sean, when the Reagan team worked with Richard Gephardt and Bill Bradley, Democrats, to get that 86 bill passed, including Dan Rostenkowski. It had nothing to do with Donald Trump at the time. Nothing to do with him at the time. What it had to do was some very bad tax policy and the failure to grandfather losses. Look, William Seidman, the late William Seidman, a dear friend of mine, was the absolutely incorruptible chairman of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And what he had to do, because of the real estate crash of the late 80s and the early 90s, because of the tax reform of 86, he had to set up a separate operation inside the FDIC to work out and sell all of the properties across the country. These are commercial properties predominantly. Savings and loans and banks were going under because of the stupid failure to grandfather this real estate thing. Had nothing to do with Donald Trump. Bill Seidman was a hero because he worked us out of it. Trump and his investments were victimized by this. That's all. There's nothing he could have done. The miracle is, as I said earlier, the guy survived, number one, and number two, he came back stronger than ever. Remember this regarding Atlantic City. His name was on the loans given to build the casinos. He personally guaranteed those loans, right? He went, and that's why he lost so much darn money. So it's not anything illegal. He was not evading anything. He was just.
Well, it's on top of that, too. I talked to somebody in his campaign today. They said, no, over the last 20 years, he's paid hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes.
Well, I'm sure that's true because my calculation, I don't know, maybe Dan can help me on this, but my calculation was that the so-called net loss carry forward was 15 years. So if 95 is your base, the thing was over by 2010, and that means for the past 5 years, I'm sure he has paid millions of dollars of taxes because he lost the net income, the net operating loss. So yeah, I'm sure that's correct. But the point is that law in 86 was not directed at Trump. Everybody got clobbered in the early 90s. Just go back and think of your own
So
home.
the 86 law basically said to more passive investors that you cannot write off losses, so they all pulled out their money.
That's correct. That it changed the speed at which the write-offs could be made. That put all kinds of people into bankruptcy, by the way. And the active investor had to take the losses him or herself. And that's the wonderful part of Trump's story is, as the active investor who got slammed by all this and lost a fortune, he came back from it, for Christ's sakes. Nobody wants to write about that. He actually had a comeback, which the venerable gray lady wrote a piece about. Sean, you and I should get hold of that piece. Somebody else told it to me by phone today. They even praised him for the comeback.
All right, last word, Daniel. We got to run.
Well, I'll just say this. I'm gonna reference Warren Buffett here because nobody's talking about him when he's in a lower tax bracket than his secretary, and he's proud of it. He's proud of it. But I don't see him writing a check to make up the difference in that loophole. So to me, this is all about an attack on Trump. It has nothing to do with what Trump has been saying. He knows how to address the issues in the tax code.
Smart. I agree with him. And anyway, glad you both could clarify. Thank you both for being with us. Larry, thank you.
Thanks,
and
Sean.
Daniel, thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Bye-bye.